What happens when you're trying to expand your faith, but you end up breaking it instead? Let's talk about it. Let me tell you a story. 1,000 years ago, Western Europe was not this powerful place that we picture today. It was fragmented and poor and trying to stabilize itself after centuries of chaos. Meanwhile, to the east, the Islamic Empire was thriving. It was full of art, culture, science, and medicine. The Byzantine Empire, which sat in between the two, was struggling. It was holding on by a thread. After losing a major battle to the Turks, the Byzantine emperor did something desperate. He sent a letter out west pleading for help. He wasn't asking for a holy war, he was just asking for mercenaries, for soldiers to come and help strengthen his borders. But that message landed on the desk of Pope Urban II, and he saw something completely different. He saw this as an opportunity. The Pope saw that this could be his moment to expand the power and influence of the church. So, how do you convince thousands of people to drop everything they're doing, move across the country, and fight in a war that they don't really understand? Pope Urban II made them an offer that they couldn't refuse. He offered them salvation. Urban promised that anyone who fought in the wars, they would have their sins forgiven, whatever sins they had confessed to. Imagine hearing that all your sins that you confess to will be forgiven in a time where heaven and hell was way more real to people than the ground beneath their feet. The message was clear. Fight for God and your soul will be saved. That promise became the ultimate spiritual marketing campaign that started the Crusades. Now, from the point of view of the Islamic empires, this was an invasion, right? They had people coming in and attacking Spain. They had people coming in and attacking what we would say is modern day Palestine and Syria, I believe. They had people coming into Sicily, right? All their territories. For them, it was an invasion. And to them, because it felt like an invasion, it felt like the entire Christian world was declaring a war on them. The campaigns for this war themselves were chaotic. The first unofficial wave, which is called the People's Crusade, it was disastrous and very chaotic, and it ended up with a lot of brutal violence against Jewish communities in Europe. Following that, the First Crusade, it was actually successful. The Christian forces were able to capture Jerusalem. But then the Second Crusade, drastically failed. It was a complete flop. Then came the legendary Third Crusade, where the Muslim leader Saladin, he recaptured Jerusalem and he faced off against King Richard. From what I read, basically what happened is he recaptured Jerusalem, and then King Richard took his armies to go to Jerusalem and take it back. And when he was there, and apparently King Richard was this great war strategist, right? He was really good at what he did. Employee of the month. And so he gets to Jerusalem, he sees it, and he realizes that they could take Jerusalem back, but they couldn't hold on to Jerusalem. So he turns all his army, his entire army away. That was my understanding of that. Interesting. Respect, truly. Eventually they made peace with this Third Crusade. Jerusalem would be under Muslim rule, and Christian pilgrims would still be allowed to visit. That was the treaty that they signed. So everything up until this point was the story of the Crusades. A very short and simplified stories, because the Crusades were over centuries. All right, it took so much research just to get it to this point. Something that's concrete and able to digest. Okay, this is what happened. But that's not the real story that I want to talk to you about today. The real story here is how faith was weaponized. You see, the Crusades weren't just fought with swords, they were fought with stories. Pope Urban II used propaganda to turn faith into a tool for power and control. They would tell false stories, right? For example, they would say that Muslims were idol worshippers, even though Islam is one of the most monotheistic religions in the world. They painted them as pagans and as enemies of God. And so these lies justified the violence. It made killing a sacred act easier to do. And it worked. They built an empire. The church used that power to control more than just armies. They were able to control kings and politicians, even people's wallets, right? The finances. In some ways, crusading became a way to enforce loyalty. Over time, the church even called crusades against other Christians that they didn't like. Faith had become a weapon, not one that could just conquer land, but also conquer people's minds. But weaponized faith always leaves a shadow. When the wars finally ended, the Crusades left behind this strange mix of discovery and destruction. On one hand, an obvious negative consequence of the Crusades is that they tore apart communities, and there was this developed deep religious hatred that we still see today. On the other hand, they opened unexpected doors. Remember how I said earlier that before the Crusades, the Islamic empires, they were thriving. Art, culture, medicine, science, among other things. Through contact with the Islamic world, Europe was able to rediscover things like science, medicine, philosophy. Through this rediscovery, we see it spark things like the Renaissance centuries later. Still, something deeper happened as a result of all of this, like something more spiritual. The Crusades were a moment where the Western world's faith turned on itself. Christianity, which preached love and humility and peace, had found a way to justify war in God's name. When Pope Urban II took that plea for help as an opportunity of spreading his power and influence, that's when this shift happened. And it's that specific contradiction, right? Preaching peace, love, and humility, and then justifying a war in God's name. That's what I call the birth of the West's spiritual anxiety. For the first time, people were asked to believe that violence could be holy, that killing could lead to heaven. And when the violence stopped and the wars ended, that moral confusion didn't just vanish, right? It got passed down generation after generation. It planted this seed of restlessness. It was this guilt and confusion and frustration that is woven into the fabric that is the West spirituality. And this anxiety shows up everywhere, right? From Reformation to the Enlightenment to the modern day call for being authentic to who you are, being authentic in your spirituality. It's this constant tension between wanting to be good and believe that you are good, but also that the religious institutions that we're a part of have caused harm. It's this uneasy feeling when you're trying to serve power and God at the same time. And here's the thing, let me be very clear. The Crusades aren't the only example of religion being weaponized, of faith being weaponized. Nearly every religion on earth has been used to justify power, expansion, exclusion at some point in time. But today I'm talking about the Crusades, and they were very unique in the scale and the impact that they had. They were global. They reshaped continents. They turned the spiritual energy of millions of people into a political force, and we still see the echoes of that today. Because when you trace the roots of modern religious conflict, or even the idea of us versus them, you can still see the Crusades' influence on that. The propaganda, the myths, the idea that God is on our side and not theirs, it's recycled language that's centuries old. So with that in mind, I'll leave you with this question. Are we still trapped in narratives that were manufactured centuries ago? Because if we are, maybe the challenge of faith today isn't about who's right or wrong, who practices better than the other. Maybe the challenge is all about breaking free from the stories that turned belief into battle. So that's it for today's video. I know it was a lot. The Crusades happened a long time ago and they went on for a really long time. So there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of research. There's different perspectives and point of view, but all the resources that I use, I'll put in the description below so you can go look for yourself. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, of course. I want to hear this idea of like weaponized faith. Like, how are we interpreting that? And how do we see it being passed down from generation to generation? And then also, I want to hear your answers to the question I left you with. Are we still living in a world where we're focused on narratives that were manufactured centuries ago? But anyway, until next time, keep asking, keep noticing, and keep this conversation blooming.